So before I answer your question, I forgot in my previous response to recognize the 6 coffee co-ops that we are working with. So they're Pumsa, Centro Cafe, Manos Campesinas, Norandino, Pangoa, and Soli Cafe. And one of my reasons for remembering that too is because I think it's easy to, before I talk about the benefits, I think it's really of digitalization. I think it's also really important to recognize the potential costs and to realize that when we're gathering information, it takes energy and resources and time to gather the data. And it's also an additional burden on farmers and agronomists and co-ops. And so I think any conversation about gathering information, even if it is ultimately of benefit to farmers and co-ops or whoever is involved in the coffee supply chain, I think it's important to just recognize that it's not frictionless. And that also that first and foremost, when we're gathering this information, we need to be very aware of data ownership and privacy and make sure that those concerns do not get lost. So with that said, there are a lot of there are some other costs to data collection beyond those that I just mentioned. And so, some of those have to do with just the time of data collection, but of course you can streamline all of those processes. So we have developed, Root Capital, one of our partners on this project, has developed an app for collecting data. And we have rolled that, it's obviously in Spanish, and we have been using that with our coffee cooperative partners to gather information. And so they've been working directly with the farmers and trying to understand information on fertilizer usage, soils, energy usage, pruning and residue management, and all the other pertinent management factors that may impact greenhouse gas emissions on a farm. And so one of the benefits of using an app such like this is the ability to generate relatively quick feedback. So rather than the traditional process of research where you plan a study and you go into the field and you collect a lot of data and then you bring it back to a lab and then you analyze it. Obviously, when you're starting a project like this, there is a bit of that slow process of data analysis, but when you are able to put these digital tools into play, you can speed that up and eliminate the friction points. So that is one of the benefits. Additionally, if we are able to quantify the carbon impacts of different coffee management practices, then there also comes the opportunity to compensate farmers for different management practices. Now, there's many different ways to do this, but for this particular project, the intention is to actually directly compensate farmers for differing levels of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of coffee output. So I think, sometimes the benefit, obviously we would prefer for there to be agronomic benefits as well. And I think that when you're collecting data for a survey such as this, it also often is a way in to discuss the different management practices that a farmer is using and how they may be useful for them, or maybe alternatives that might be available to them. And that's a really nice opportunity. But in addition to that, if you can also have some monetary benefit, there is a huge amount of value to that, especially for smallholder producers who may otherwise be somewhat on the margins economically. So another question you had was, why should the industry invest in digitalization of these tools? And I think that my most basic answer is that if you do not measure and quantify, then you don't really have a basis for knowing where you are. And if you don't know where you are, you don't know whether or not the changes you may be making are leading you in the right direction or in a direction that is not where you want to go. So usually forming a baseline of emissions is a first step, and then you can look at different management interventions and assess the impact and whether or not those are steering you towards your supply chain commitments, for example, if you are a company. So, and other reasons why the industry should invest is that, you know, companies, or sorry, consumers, they increasingly want to also purchase food items and coffee specifically that has lower negative DHG impacts. And I think that's, you know, it's still sort of coming along, but over time, there's just an increasing awareness of consumers that every product that they purchase has some sort of greenhouse gas impact. And if you can demonstrate on a package of coffee that this coffee actually helps sequester carbon, for example, then I think that has a great benefit for selling that coffee. Investment is also needed in science. So I think just to clarify, I think it's really important to recognize that while we have our tool and we have a model for quantifying greenhouse gas emissions, all models have some level of error. And so I think the more that we can have standardization and resources dedicated towards the science. So for example, refining our allometric curves, which are used to estimate biomass, understanding the impacts of wet residue management, the GHG emissions if a farmer is using composting, the decomposition of roots, all of those things require a lot of resources. And so I think the more that supply chain partners and industry can band together and help co-fund those developments and the science, I think there's huge benefits to be gained, especially having some centralized information rather than having a fragmented ecosystem. So it's great to hear about projects like Vanessa's and to know that we can all come together and create some resources that can be used by everyone. So yeah, I think there are so many different reasons for industry to invest, but I think that digitalization really is likely to become more prevalent in the future.